The mountain didn't care that Sergeant Dara Osei was running out of time. It hadn't cared for the past 6 hours either, not when the temperature dropped below -40, not when her GPS unit cracked from the cold and went dark, and not when the storm that the weather station had categorized as a moderate alpine disturbance turned into something that stripped the bark off trees and sent them spinning into the gray nothing like paper scraps. She ran because stopping meant dying. That's the arithmetic of survival in extreme cold. It doesn't negotiate. It doesn't offer extensions. Your core temperature drops, your decision-making degrades, your extremities start shutting down in a quiet, almost polite sequence, fingers first, then toes, then cognition itself. You stop thinking clearly, you start making comfortable choices, and comfortable choices in a frozen wilderness are almost always fatal. Dara was a SEER instructor: survival, evasion, resistance, and escape. She taught soldiers how to survive conditions exactly like this one. She knew the curriculum. She'd written parts of it. And right now she was failing her own course. The training exercise had gone wrong at hour 2. A freak pressure system. Meteorologists would later spend 3 weeks arguing about what exactly it was and why none of their models had predicted it, had descended on the Alaskan range with a speed that defied seasonal norms. What was supposed to be a solo navigation exercise, 48 hours, no resupply, evaluate and return, had become something else entirely. Her emergency beacon had gone out with the GPS unit, casualties of the same violent temperature drop that had flash-frozen the moisture seals. She had her pack. She had her training. She had the mountain. 2 of those things were trying to kill her. Dara forced herself to think methodically, which was harder than it sounds when your hands are losing sensation and the wind is loud enough to make your own heartbeat inaudible. There were caves marked on the topographical overlay she'd memorized before departure. Old volcanic formations, most of them shallow, but some of them deep enough to offer real shelter. She'd passed the area notation roughly 40 minutes ago, which meant, if she'd maintained her bearing through the whiteout, which was not guaranteed, she should be within a kilometer of the largest marked formation. She adjusted her heading 3 degrees east and kept moving. The cave entrance appeared the way salvation always does in a survival scenario. Suddenly, without ceremony, as a dark gap in a cliff face that she nearly walked past because her vision had narrowed to the immediate 2 meters in front of her boots. She didn't hesitate. She went in. The cave was real shelter, not warm but out of the wind, which was the difference between surviving the next 6 hours and not. She went 10 meters in, far enough that the storm's roar dropped to a manageable howl, and dropped to one knee to begin the controlled assessment she'd drilled into hundreds of students. Check injuries. Check resources. Check environment. She was running through the second item when her eyes adjusted to the darkness well enough to register that she was not alone. Something was in the back of the cave. Dara's hand moved to her sidearm, standard carry, even on training exercises, before her brain had consciously processed what she was seeing, which is what good training does. It creates responses that outpace conscious thought. But her hand stopped at the grip without drawing, because conscious thought caught up a half-second later, and conscious thought said, "That is not a bear." It was roughly humanoid. That was the first thing. Bipedal, with a general bilateral symmetry that her pattern recognition systems filed under person-shaped, before immediately flagging everything else as wrong. Too tall, she estimated almost 2.5 meters, though it was seated with its back against the cave wall, which made precise estimation difficult. The limbs were proportionally longer than human norms. The coloring was wrong in a way she couldn't immediately quantify in the darkness. A blue-gray that seemed less like skin and more like something adaptive, something that changed slightly as she watched. It was injured. That was the second thing and in some ways the more immediately important one. Even in the low light, she could see the way it held its left side, one of the longer arms pressed tight against what would have been the ribcage analog on a human body. The posture she recognized across any species that had ever been hurt. It was the posture of something trying to make itself smaller against pain. It was looking at her. The eyes were large by human proportion, not grotesquely so but notably. Adapted to low light, she thought automatically. The iris, or what served as one, caught the faint gray light from the cave entrance and reflected it back in a way that was neither frightening nor welcoming. It was simply watching. Neither of them moved for what felt like a significant amount of time but was probably 11 seconds. Dara made a decision. She made it the way she always made decisions under pressure, not from emotion and not from doctrine, but from the intersection of available information and probable outcomes. She was a SEER instructor, not a xenobiologist. She had never been trained for first contact because, 6 hours ago, first contact was a theoretical concept that belonged to physics papers and Senate subcommittee hearings, not to a cave in the Alaskan range during a freak storm. But she had been trained in prisoner handling, in hostile population interaction, in the de-escalation protocols that the Army had spent decades refining after learning the hard way that threat displays against a wounded opponent often produced worse outcomes than controlled calm. The principles, she decided, probably transferred. She took her hand off the sidearm. Slowly, with the hand open and visible, because open hands read as non-threatening across virtually every human culture she'd studied, and she was going to bet that the principle had some universality to it. She lowered herself from the crouch to a seated position, deliberately matching the creature's posture, putting herself at the same approximate eye level. Then she did nothing. She held the position, kept her hands visible, regulated her breathing, which took real effort because her body's threat response was filing extensive complaints, and waited. The creature watched her for another long moment. Then it made a sound. Not a roar, not a threat display. Something quieter than that and more complicated. A sequence of tones that rose and fell in a pattern that her brain, hunting for familiar frameworks, almost classified as language. Almost. She couldn't be sure. But it was directed at her, and it was not aggressive, and the creature's posture had changed, not relaxed but recalibrated. It was reassessing, the way a cornered animal reassesses when the thing it expected to attack it doesn't. Dara nodded once. It was a stupid gesture, she was aware. The creature might not have any cultural context for the movement. But it was what she had, a small visible signal that she was engaging in communication rather than threat. Outside, the storm intensified. Inside the cave, two injured beings from different stars sat 6 meters apart and tried to figure out if the other one was safe. That, Dara thought, is probably how it always starts. Not with a fleet. Not with a declaration. Not with weapons or fanfare or the dramatic speeches that politicians rehearsed for the cameras. With two individuals in the dark, deciding whether to be afraid of each other. The first hour was purely observational. Dara had been trained to gather intelligence before acting, and even in circumstances so far outside any training manual that the manual might as well have been written in a different language, the instinct held. She watched. She catalogued. She tried to build a picture from the available evidence. The creature was female, or presented features that Dara's biological intuition classified as female, which she acknowledged was a projection but noted anyway. The build was different from the broader, more heavily armored frame she'd expect from a male of most species that showed sexual dimorphism. The features, what she could read of them, were finer. The hands, and she used the word loosely for the four-fingered appendages at the end of the long arms, moved differently when the creature adjusted its position, with a precision that spoke of fine motor capability rather than raw grip strength. The injury was serious. Dara could tell that much without a medical degree. Every time the creature shifted its weight, there was a sharp stillness that followed, the micro-freeze of a body managing acute pain. Something on the left side, below what passed for a shoulder at the ribcage level. Internal, possibly. Or a wound covered by the suit. Because there was a suit. This was the detail that Dara kept returning to as the first hour passed. The creature was wearing technology. Not wearing it the way animals wore markings or humans wore clothing, wearing it the way a soldier wore a tactical vest, functionally and deliberately. The material was unlike anything she'd encountered, a seamless construction that seemed to shift its surface properties slightly in response to the cave's temperature, but the logic of it was recognizable. Coverage over vital areas. Articulation at the joints. Something at the collar that looked like it could serve a communications function, though it appeared damaged. A crack running along the device's casing that matched the pattern of the injury beneath it. Whatever had happened to her, it had happened violently. And she was alone. That last observation carried weight. Dara turned it over carefully. If this creature had arrived as part of a group, crew, squad, team, whatever the organizational unit was, the natural behavior after an injury would be to stay with the group or for the group to stay with her. She was here alone. Which meant either she had been separated by accident, which implied a scenario that went significantly wrong, or she had been separated deliberately, which implied a scenario that went even worse. Either way, she was not in contact with her own people. That, Dara reflected with a strange calm, was something they had in common. She took stock of her own resources with the same methodical attention she'd given the creature's condition. Her pack contained the standard SEER training loadout, fire-starting materials, emergency rations for 48 hours, a basic medical kit, a Mylar emergency blanket, paracord, a water filtration system, and a fixed-blade knife that she'd carried for 11 years without ever using it on anything except rope and food packaging. Her handgun held 15 rounds plus one in the chamber. She had a secondary magazine. She was not going to use the gun. She decided that in the first 30 seconds, and she was becoming more certain of it as time passed. The creature was injured and apparently non-aggressive. Shooting it would be the least strategically sound decision available to her, even setting aside the ethical dimensions, which she was deliberately not setting aside. You don't shoot the person who might be your only ally in a survival situation. That principle also probably transferred. The temperature in the cave was stable, cold, but manageable with movement and the right equipment. She needed to get warmer. She had the mylar blanket. She also had the fire kit, and she could see enough drywood debris in the cave's interior that a small, controlled fire was viable. Fire would change the dynamic. She thought about that for 2 full minutes before deciding it was worth the risk. Fire was light and warmth, both of which she needed, and both of which would make the situation more readable for the creature across from her. Darkness was ambiguous. Light allowed assessment. She wanted to be accessible. She wanted the creature to be able to look at her and conclude, this is a creature trying to survive, not trying to attack. She moved slowly when she retrieved the fire kit from her pack. She kept her body language open at every step. No sudden movements, no reaching behind her back where her hands would disappear from the creature's sight lines. She gathered the wood from the cave floor in small amounts, building the pile gradually, narrating her actions in a low, steady voice, not because she thought the creature understood English but because the tone of her voice was itself a signal. Calm, measured, purposeful. When she struck the flint, the creature flinched at the sharp sound. When the small flame caught, it was still. The firelight changed everything. Dara got her first real look at the creature, and the creature got its first real look at her, and for a long moment both of them simply processed what they were seeing. She could now confirm what the darkness had only suggested. The blue-gray skin tone was genuinely adaptive, not coloration but something active, pigment cells responding to stimuli. The eyes were amber, deep amber, with pupils that contracted visibly in response to the firelight. The facial structure was different enough from human to be clearly alien and similar enough to human to be legible. She could read the expression, or thought she could. Caution. Curiosity. Not aggression. Dara held her hands toward the fire, palms out, warming them, yes, but also keeping them visible and offering the warmth of the signal itself. This is what fire is for, this is what I'm doing with it. The creature watched for a long time. Then, slowly, with the careful deliberateness of something that knew every movement costed something, it shifted its position. Not toward her. Just slightly toward the fire. Toward the warmth. That was the first communication. Not language. Not technology. Just the oldest acknowledgement two beings capable of cold can offer each other. Yes, warmth is what we need, and you have made some, and I am willing to accept it. Dara exhaled. She reached into her pack and pulled out one of the emergency ration bars. She held it for a moment, then set it on the cave floor midway between them. Not offering it directly, that was too much movement, too much invasion of space. Just making it available. Just saying, I have food and I am leaving some in the middle, you can decide what to do with it. The creature looked at the ration bar for a long time. It didn't touch it. But it didn't look away from it either, which Dara filed as meaningful. Recognition. Some understanding of what the gesture meant, even without language. She settled back and tended the fire and let the silence be what it was. Not empty but full of the slow, careful work of two minds trying to find the signal in the noise. Somewhere outside, the storm was still in the process of making its argument about human irrelevance. Dara had stopped listening to it. She had more important work. By the 3rd hour she had a name. Not a real name. Not in the phonemic sense, because the creature's communication system used tonal elements that Dara's vocal apparatus couldn't reproduce with any confidence. But she had a designation, a working label derived from observation. She called her Kale for reasons that were half practical and half instinctive. The creature had made a sound in the 2nd hour that repeated consistently, a 2-syllable tonal cluster that Dara had begun to associate with the creature's reference to itself. She didn't know if she was hearing it correctly. But she needed something to call her in her own internal narration, and Kale was what her mind had settled on. She thought of it as a draft. A placeholder. Everything in this situation was a placeholder until verified. The communication that was developing between them was painstaking and strange and, Dara thought, probably the most important thing that had happened on Earth in recorded history, which was an observation she was deliberately filing away for later, because engaging with its full weight would compromise her functional calm, and she needed her functional calm. It worked in layers. The first layer was gesture and posture. This was the most immediately available channel, and also the most dangerous one to over-rely on, because she had no way of knowing which gestures carried meaning across the biology and culture gap. She worked conservatively, Small movements, often repeated, always anchored to observable reference. She pointed at the fire, then at herself, then mimed the act of building it, to establish that she had made it. She pointed at the ration bar on the cave floor, then at her own mouth to establish that it was food. She pointed at her own wound, a cut on her forearm from a fall she'd taken 2 hours before finding the cave, and then at Cale's injured side, not to demand access but to say, "I see that you are hurt, I am also hurt, we are alike in this specific way." Cale watched each gesture with an attention that Dara found both reassuring and slightly unnerving. It was the attention of something intelligent, not the reactive attention of animal threat assessment, but the focused, analytical engagement of a mind processing novel information. At several points, Cale made small movements that seemed to be responses, not mimicry but replies. A deliberate shift of the injured arm. A brief gesture with one of those four-fingered hands. A change in the sound she was producing. The second layer was the damaged technology. Cale's suit had a functioning component that the injury hadn't reached. A small device embedded in the right forearm, roughly the size and position of a watch, that produced a faint luminescence in patterns that seemed to correlate with Cale's attempts at communication. Dara had noticed it in the second hour and spent 40 minutes observing it before concluding it was probably linguistic. A visual component to a communication system that used multiple simultaneous channels. The patterns were complex. She couldn't decode them. But she could observe when they changed and she could associate those changes with context, and that association was the beginning of something. She retrieved a small notebook from her pack. She always carried one, an analog habit in a digital world, which her colleagues found archaic and which had saved her twice in the field, and began documenting. Writing in the cold was difficult. Her fingers had regained enough sensation from the fire to manage a pencil, barely. She drew rough representations of the light patterns as they appeared, numbering each one, noting the context and Cale's simultaneous posture and sound. Cale watched her write. The third hour, Cale reached toward the ration bar. Not to take it, to touch it. Brief, tentative, the way you test an unfamiliar surface. Then she withdrew and looked at the device on her forearm, and a new pattern appeared. One Dara hadn't seen before, held for almost 10 seconds, then faded. Dara wrote it down. Context. Investigating offered food. She had 43 distinct patterns catalogued by the end of the third hour. What she also had, by the end of the third hour, was a working hypothesis about Cale's situation that was considerably more alarming than simple injury and storm-related displacement. It was built from inference and physical evidence, and she was careful not to treat it as confirmed, but it was real enough that it changed how she was thinking about her priorities. The crash. She hadn't let herself fully process the implication when she'd first noted the suit damage and the communications device failure, because processing implications takes cognitive bandwidth that she'd needed for more immediate concerns. But in the quieter third hour, the picture assembled itself with a clarity she couldn't defer. Cale hadn't walked into this cave. The suit's damage pattern, the crack at the collar, the scoring along the left side that she could now see more clearly in the firelight, wasn't consistent with falls or combat injury. It was consistent with impact. High-velocity, high-energy impact of the kind that left material deformation rather than cuts or punctures. The injuries beneath the suit were probably similar in character. Blunt trauma from deceleration, not from a weapon or a fight. Cale had been in something that came down hard. There was a crash site somewhere in this mountain range. There were, potentially, other members of whatever crew or team Cale had been part of. There was, certainly, technology capable of interstellar travel, or at minimum technology that a human civilization in 2024 could not replicate, sitting in pieces somewhere on the Alaskan tundra. And nobody on Earth knew about any of it except one SEER instructor in a cave with a compromised emergency beacon and a dead GPS unit. Dara set her notebook on her knee and stared at the fire for a while. She thought about what her responsibilities were in this situation, catalogued them carefully, and concluded that they were essentially three: survive the immediate environment, do not cause harm to the being across from her, and get information to people who needed to have it as soon as the storm allowed. In that order. She also concluded something else. Something that wasn't in any doctrine or manual, something that was just her own judgment, developed over 15 years of operating in difficult environments with people who didn't always share her language or her culture or her frame of reference. Cale was afraid. Not of Dara specifically. Of the situation. Of being injured and alone and in an alien environment. Which, Dara reflected, was precisely what she herself was experiencing, and the parallel was not lost on her. They were both stranded. They were both hurt. They were both alone in an environment that was trying to kill them, relying on their training and their intelligence and each other's, in the absence of anything better. She added one more entry to her notebook. Subject is intelligent. Subject is non-hostile. Subject is injured and appears to be alone. Working hypothesis: separation from a larger event. Priority: establish enough communication to assess medical situation and mutual threat picture before storm breaks. She is not the threat. The situation is the threat. Treat accordingly. At the 4-hour mark, Cale tried to stand and couldn't. It wasn't a dramatic collapse. It was quieter and worse than that, a careful, controlled attempt that got approximately halfway before the body refused to continue, and the careful control became the controlled surrender of someone who understood what their limits were and chose to accept them rather than fight past them into damage. She lowered herself back against the cave wall with a precision that spoke of discipline, and the sound she made wasn't a cry of pain but something shorter and flatter, an acknowledgement. Dara was on her feet before she'd made a conscious decision to move. She stopped herself 4 steps in, because moving quickly toward an injured, possibly frightened being was exactly the wrong instinct to act on, regardless of what her helping reflex demanded. She stopped. She breathed. She held up one hand, slowly, clearly, and waited. Cale watched her from the ground. After a moment, Dara crouched down to the cave floor again, matching the eye level. She held up her medical kit, a small, hard-sided case, and opened it slowly so the contents were visible. Gauze, medical tape, antiseptic wipes, a pressure bandage, a small pair of scissors, a chemical heat pack. She held the kit out in a way that was demonstrably non-threatening, because a medical kit was the size of a paperback novel and she was showing it openly to a being that outmassed her by approximately 40 kilograms. Then she waited. She was not going to approach without permission. She didn't have the concept of consent in Cale's language, but she had the concept of waiting for a response before acting, and she was going to hold that line because it was the right thing to do and also because any other approach was likely to undo every fragile milligram of trust they'd built across the past 4 hours. The waiting took 7 minutes. At the end of 7 minutes, Cale made a sound Dara hadn't heard before, a single tone, descending, held for about 2 seconds, and then slowly moved the arm that had been pressed against her injured side away from it. Not all the way, but enough. Enough was permission. Dara moved in slowly, maintaining the open posture, narrating her movements in the same low, steady tone she'd been using throughout. She wasn't sure if the narration helped. She was sure it didn't hurt. I'm moving closer. I'm going to look at the injury. I'm not going to touch you without showing you what I'm doing first. The suit was the first obstacle. She couldn't see through it and she couldn't assess the injury through it, and she had no idea how to remove it or whether removing it was possible without specialist knowledge she didn't have. She examined the damaged area carefully, close enough now that she could see details the firelight hadn't offered from 6 meters. The material was compromised along a roughly 15-centimeter diagonal that started below the equivalent of the collarbone and tracked down toward the left side. The edges of the damage were dark, which could mean several things on human equipment and probably meant at least some of the same things here. She looked up at Cale. She touched her own forearm, the cut she'd cleaned an hour ago. She pointed at it, then pointed at Cale's damaged suit, then held up the antiseptic wipe. Cale's amber eyes tracked the gesture. She reached up with the undamaged arm and did something to the suit's collar, a manipulation that Dara couldn't fully follow, and a section of the material along the damage line loosened. Not removed, but accessible. Dara cleaned her hands first. Then she worked carefully, using the minimal intervention principle she applied to all field medicine. See what you have, clean what you can reach, stabilize what's unstable, do no harm through action. The injury beneath the suit was unlike human anatomy in specifics and similar to it in general principle. She was looking at tissue damage and what appeared to be significant bruising to a structural area, analogous to broken ribs, without the certainty that her anatomical knowledge transferred. There was fluid, dark, not red, but fluid in a way that was consistent with the kind of seepage she'd associate with internal bruising rather than active hemorrhage, which she chose to read as a cautiously positive sign. She cleaned the accessible area. She did not probe. She applied the pressure bandage with a lightness she'd learned treating soldiers who were too shocked to feel how hard you were pressing, and she watched Cale's response to every contact, looking for signs that she was causing harm she couldn't see. The sounds Cale made during the process were low and controlled. There was pain in them. There was also, Dara thought, something like trust, the particular vulnerability of allowing yourself to be helped, which is a different kind of strength than enduring pain alone. When she'd done what she could do, she sat back. Cale looked at the bandaging for a long moment. Then she reached toward her suit's forearm device, and the light patterns appeared, a sequence Dara hadn't seen, complex and sustained. She wrote it down. She would spend a long time with this entry later, in a very different setting than a cave, working with people who had far more resources than a notebook and a pencil. But she thought she understood what it meant even then. She thought it meant thank you. The fire needed feeding. Dara tended it, and they sat in the warmth of it together, and after a while Dara took out the second ration bar and ate half of it, slowly, visibly, and then set the other half at the midpoint again, not the same bar from before, which was still there untouched, and returned to her side. Kale watched the half bar. Then she did something that stopped Dara's breathing for a full second. She reached into a compartment in the suit, a small storage area at the hip that Dara hadn't noticed, and withdrew something. It was small, flat, and its surface was producing a faint, steady luminescence. She held it for a moment, looking at it, and then set it on the cave floor between them, mirroring the gesture, offering something of her own. The item on the cave floor was almost certainly a piece of technology beyond anything Dara was qualified to evaluate. It was also, in this moment, not a piece of technology at all. It was an act of reciprocity. It was the universal grammar of two beings deciding to trust each other, expressed in the oldest language available. I showed you mine. Here is mine. Dara looked at it for a long time. She didn't touch it. Not yet. That wasn't what the moment required. Okay, she said quietly to the fire and to Kale and to herself and to no one. Okay. We can work with this. The storm ended at 0347, which Dara knew because she'd maintained her watch when everything else had failed, winding it manually every 6 hours as her father had taught her with the same model 30 years ago. Analog reliability in digital failure, another archaic habit that was paying dividends. She'd slept in 3-hour increments, keeping the fire alive, keeping her core temperature viable, waking for watch intervals she held more out of discipline than tactical necessity. Kale had slept, or done something that resembled sleep, a deep metabolic slowdown that had lasted about 5 hours and from which she'd emerged more stabilized, her posture less rigid against the pain. The body healing itself. That, at least, transferred without translation. In the quiet of the early morning, before the sky outside the cave had lightened enough to be useful, Dara sat with her notebook and organized what she had. 43 light patterns, catalogued with context notes. A rough anatomical sketch of Kale's build, the kind of documentation that would have value for people qualified to interpret it. Observations on the suit's material properties, the communication device's behavior, the storage compartment's location, the object Kale had placed between them, which was still there in the middle of the cave floor, untouched by either of them, radiating its quiet light like a question waiting to be answered. She wrote at the top of the page, first contact occurred. Alpine Cave, Alaskan Range. Approximate duration of initial contact, 14 hours. Subject designation, Kale, provisional. Assessment, intelligent, injured, non-hostile, appears to be alone. Technology level significantly exceeds current human capability. Origin unknown. Mutual communication in early development. Recommend immediate specialist response. This is not a threat scenario. Repeat, this is not a threat scenario. She underlined the last two sentences. She underlined them because she knew, with the certainty of long experience with institutional responses, that the default framing would be threat. The default framing was always threat, because threat was the category that justified resources and response and the kind of rapid mobilization that systems were built to provide. Framing this as a threat scenario would get faster action. It would also, she was fairly certain, get someone killed, possibly her, possibly Kale, possibly both of them, through the compounding errors of a response calibrated for combat rather than contact. She was going to fight that framing as hard as she could from whatever position she found herself in. When the light outside had grown enough to navigate, Dara packed her kit carefully. She looked at Kale across the dying fire, and she thought about the next problem. Communication about the transition from here, in the cave, to somewhere with people and resources, without a shared language, in a situation where the difference between an exit to the north and an exit to the south probably carried implications she couldn't fully model. Kale had been watching her pack. The amber eyes moved from the pack to Dara's face, and the forearm device activated. The pattern Dara had catalogued as number 7, which she'd tentatively associated with inquiry. The rising tone quality of it, the open-ended shape. A question. Dara pointed at the cave entrance. She pointed at herself. She mimed the act of walking, slowly, exaggeratedly, 2 fingers walking across her palm. She held up the notebook. She mimed writing, then held up the notebook again. I need to go to where people are. I need to tell them what happened here. She didn't know how much of that arrived. What arrived, she thought, was enough. She was indicating departure and indicating it with context that suggested purpose rather than threat. Because Kale's response was not alarm, it was another question, a different pattern, one Dara hadn't catalogued yet. Something new. She wrote it down while she was looking at it. Then Kale did something unexpected. She reached for the object between them, the flat, luminescent device she'd placed there the night before, and held it for a moment. Then she extended it toward Dara. Not to the midpoint this time. Extended directly, a deliberate offer. Dara understood the difference. She received the object with both hands, the two-handed receive, the posture of careful respect that she'd learned watching 15 different cultures exchange things of value, and she held it without activating anything, without pressing anything, without doing more than acknowledging its weight and its warmth and its significance. She pointed at the object. She pointed at herself. She looked at Kale. Keeping this? The descending tone. The single note. The pattern she'd decided in the 4th hour to read as affirmation. She put the device in her pack very carefully in the main compartment with her notebook. Then she did something that wasn't in any doctrine. She reached into her kit, retrieved a single object, the wound closure strips she hadn't used on her own arm, still in their sterile packaging, aluminum foil bright and clearly human-made, and she placed them on the cave floor at the midpoint. Something of mine for something of yours. She didn't know if the symmetry registered. She thought maybe it did. The journey out took 4 hours. The snow had softened enough to move through, and the temperature had risen to survivable without extraordinary effort, and she followed the bearing that her memorized topographic knowledge said would bring her to the ranger station, which was approximately 9 kilometers east and 600 meters lower in elevation. She did not look back at the cave as she left. She wanted to. She chose not to because she thought looking back would mean something to her that she wasn't ready to process while she still needed to navigate, and she was still operating under the discipline of one problem at a time. She reached the ranger station at 0911. The ranger on duty, a woman named Jess Paulson, 32 years on the job, who had seen most things that mountains produce, took one look at Dara and started calling in an emergency medical response. Dara accepted the blanket and the warm liquid and the concern, and when she had enough of both to be functional, she put her hand on Paulson's forearm and said, "I need you to call Fort Richardson. I need to speak to someone with a security clearance above the base commander level. This is not a medical emergency. I need you to hear what I'm saying." Paulson looked at her. "What happened out there, Sergeant?" Dara thought about the 14 hours in the cave. She thought about the fire and the ration bar and the pressure bandage and the object that was still warm through the wall of her pack. She thought about the 43 light patterns in her notebook and the language she'd barely started to learn. "First contact," she said. "And we need to get it right." The world's first alien contact protocol had been written in 1994 by a joint working group that included 2 astronomers, a Navy admiral, a linguist from MIT, and a State Department official who kept insisting on the relevance of the Vienna Convention. It had been revised 7 times since then, most recently in 2019, and it ran to approximately 400 pages including appendices. Dara read the relevant sections in a secured room at Fort Richardson, wrapped in a thermal blanket with a mug of coffee that someone kept refilling, while a succession of people with increasing levels of authority and decreasing levels of composure came in and out of the room and asked her to repeat herself. She repeated herself. The protocol, she quickly discovered, had a significant structural problem. It was designed around the scenario of receiving a signal, something distant, processable, mediated by technology and time and the comfortable remove of interstellar distance. It was not designed for the scenario of a seer instructor who had spent 14 hours sitting across a fire from an alien being and was now describing behavioral observations, medical assessments, and a device of extraterrestrial origin that was currently in an evidence bag being handled by people in gloves who kept looking at it as if it might do something. It was, she noted in the margin of the protocol document, she kept writing in margins, it was a reflex, designed for a committee to receive information. Not for a person who had already received it. The first 24 hours were controlled chaos. The machinery of institutional response has its own logic, its own momentum, and it takes time for that machinery to recalibrate around a situation it wasn't designed for. There were jurisdictional conversations. There were calls to Washington and people being woken up at 0300 and briefings assembled on insufficient information by people who had never done this before, because no one had ever done this before. Dara was patient. She told her story accurately and completely each time, without embellishment, without editorial commentary, without the temptation to make it more dramatic than it already was, which was a discipline because it was already dramatic enough to destabilize several of the people listening to it. She provided her notebook. She provided the photographs she'd taken on a backup disposable camera she'd been carrying, another analog habit that she was now profoundly grateful for. She provided the technical device. She requested each time that the response to the cave be non-military in its lead posture. The request was heard. She wasn't sure yet if it would be followed. The crash site was found on day 2. Search teams following the vectors she described located wreckage approximately 14 kilometers from the cave, in a high valley that the storm had emptied of witnesses and then filled with fresh snow, which had preserved both the debris field and, critically, its thermal signature. The site was substantial. Whatever had come down had been larger than a reconnaissance vehicle. The analysts, working from photographs that Dara was briefly shown, estimated the original craft at between 40 and 60 meters in length. It had not come down gently. There were no other survivors. That information arrived while Dara was in her 4th debriefing, delivered with a careful neutrality by a lieutenant colonel whose expression said clearly that he understood the weight of what he was telling her. She received it without expression. She wrote in her notebook, "Kale is alone. Her people did not survive. This is now also a casualty situation and a grief situation and a situation in which a being who has already experienced catastrophic loss is going to have to navigate an alien institutional response without any of the contextual support that normally makes that navigable. She needs an advocate. She needs someone who has already established communication, who she has already determined is non-threatening, who understands enough of her behavioral language to give her accurate signals about what is happening. She needs me there. This is not ego. This is operational assessment." She handed the note to the lieutenant colonel. He read it twice. "You want to go back to the cave," he said. "I want to be part of whatever team makes contact at the cave, yes. Not leading it. Contributing to it. With clear protocols about what signals mean and what signals I've already established and how to avoid the default threat response escalation that happens when 2 parties have insufficient communication infrastructure. The State Department has a linguist. I have 43 documented behavioral communicative patterns from direct observation. The linguist has 400 pages of SETI protocol designed for radio wave analysis. These are not equivalent resources for this specific situation." Another silence. "How long did you say you were in the cave?" he asked. 14 hours and approximately 30 minutes. "And in that time she provided you with a piece of technology voluntarily, accepted medical treatment, and offered you something from her personal equipment?" "Yes." "And you believe that constitutes a trust relationship sufficient to serve as a communication bridge for whatever comes next?" "I believe it constitutes the beginning of one. Which is more than we currently have anywhere else." The lieutenant colonel picked up his phone. On day 4, Dara was on a helicopter heading back toward the cave. The team with her was smaller than she'd feared and better calibrated than she'd hoped. A xenobiologist from JPL who had spent 20 years preparing for exactly this call and was visibly working to stay functional. A signals analyst from the National Security Agency who had the useful quality of being professionally unflappable. An emergency medicine physician who had been chosen specifically for her cross-cultural work in conflict zones. And a linguist from Berkeley who had, in fact, read the protocol documents and also had the good sense to know their limitations. No weapons drawn. That had been Dara's condition. Not no weapons, that was unrealistic and she hadn't asked for the unrealistic. But no weapons drawn, no threat posture, no formation approach. They went in as people going to help someone who was injured and alone. She briefed them for the full 45 minutes of the flight, covering everything in her notebook. "When we arrive," she said, "let me enter first. I'll use the established signals to communicate that I've brought others and that they're non-hostile. Do not make sudden movements. Do not make extended direct eye contact. I'm not certain of the social significance but the data suggest it may read as challenge. If she activates the forearm device, I need everyone to hold position and let me document before we react." She looked around the helicopter at 5 people who were 3 days away from the ordinary facts of their careers and were now sitting in a military aircraft heading toward a first contact scenario. "She is injured and alone and she has lost everyone she came here with," Dara said. "Whatever else this is, that's true. Keep that in your heads." The cave was exactly as she'd left it. The fire was long dead. The cold ration bar was still on the cave floor at the midpoint, still there, untouched. The wound closure strips were gone. Kale was in the back of the cave in the same position, watching Dara cross the threshold with the same stillness she'd shown in the first moment 14 hours and 4 days ago. Dara held up her open hands. She made the sound she'd been practicing on the helicopter, an approximation, imperfect, of the pattern she'd catalogued as affirmation. The descending tone. Single note. "I came back." The amber eyes stayed on her. Then Kale made a sound. The linguist beside her quietly said, "I need to record that," and held up his device with a slowness that was almost comically careful. Dara held up one hand to ask him to wait. She was listening. She had heard that pattern before. Not in the cave but in her own head, in the 4 days between the first contact and this moment, going through her notebook and building the grammar of what she documented, finding the shapes in it, the way patterns combined and modified and qualified each other. She had heard it and she had marked it as unclassified, not because it wasn't occurring, but because she hadn't had enough context to categorize it. She had context now. It was the pattern that appeared when Kale had set her device at the midpoint. The pattern that appeared when she'd extended it directly. The pattern that appeared now when she looked at Dara standing at the cave entrance with 5 humans behind her. It wasn't a question. It wasn't fear. Dara looked back at the linguist and said quietly, "I think it means you are what I expected." She wasn't certain. She would spend a long time working to be certain. But she walked forward into the cave and she sat down and she put her notebook on her knee, and she began to introduce, very slowly, 5 more humans to the most important being they would ever meet. The formal documentation of the initial contact period runs to 11 volumes, classified at a level that has no public designation. Dara has read all of it. She contributed substantially to it. There are sections she disputes, interpretations she challenged in committee with evidence and patience and the specific stubbornness of someone who was present and knows the difference between what happened and what was inferred. This is the version she tells when asked. Not the official one. Hers. The medical situation was the first priority. It remained the first priority for the initial 2 weeks, during which the question of alien first contact was in many respects secondary to the question of keeping Kale alive. The emergency physician, Dr. Amara, had the combination of knowledge, adaptability, and calm that the situation required, and she and Kale established a working relationship over the examination process that Dara watched with the particular attention she gave to things she needed to document and also the particular feeling of watching something important happen. 2 healers, separated by species and biology and vast distances of space, finding the grammar of care across the gap. The treatment that ultimately stabilized Kale's injuries was a collaborative development. Human understanding of medicine, modified through careful trial and the guidance of whatever Kale could communicate about her own physiology. It was not fast. It was not clean. There were 3 crises in the first week that Dara won't describe in detail even now, each of which could have ended differently. They didn't. Communication expanded slowly, non-linearly, in the way that real language acquisition always works. Not a steady upward curve but a series of plateaus and sudden jumps. Moments where a piece of the structure suddenly clarified and the comprehension that had been building beneath the surface became accessible. The linguist, whose name was Dr. Ree and who turned out to have the useful quality of finding genuine joy in the work, described it later as the most terrifying and most satisfying thing I have ever done professionally, sometimes within the same hour. By week 3, they had approximately 400 verified communicative exchanges. By month 2 they had the beginning of a shared lexicon. Not language exactly but the scaffolding for it. Concepts mapped to concepts. The understanding not of words but of categories, of the shapes that meaning takes and how those shapes could be built out of available materials from both sides. What they learned in that period was not released in its entirety. What Dara is permitted to describe is selective, and she is at peace with that selectivity because she understands its rationale, even where she disputes specific decisions. The full scope of what Kale communicated, once communication became possible, is a matter still being processed by people and institutions at levels far above any single sergeant's clearance. What she can say is this. Kale had not come to Earth with hostile intent. The mission her crew had been conducting was, as best Dara could determine, something analogous to reconnaissance. Not military reconnaissance, the kind aimed at identifying vulnerabilities and preparing for conflict, but scientific reconnaissance of the kind that humans had been doing with unmanned probes for 50 years. Observation. Documentation. Assessment of what was here. The craft had experienced a catastrophic failure. The kind of failure that, if you knew the physics of what they were attempting, should probably have been survivable. It wasn't. The crew had been 7. Kale had survived through a combination of her position in the craft at the moment of failure and what Dara gradually understood was not luck but training, the kind of training that becomes reflex, that saves your life in the seconds before conscious thought can intervene. She was the sole survivor of her crew. That was not a fact to be processed quickly. Dara knew something about loss. She'd lost soldiers, she'd carried the specific weight of surviving what others hadn't, and she recognized in Kale's behavior in the months that followed, the particular topography of grief. It didn't express itself identically to human grief, but it was real. It demanded acknowledgement. What Dara gave her in those months was the thing she'd decided on in the cave on the first night. She treated Cale as an equal. Not in the performative, declarative way that policies use the word. In the operational way. She was the person in the room who was least impressed by Cale's origin and most interested in who she actually was. What she thought, what she valued, what she found difficult, what she found interesting about humans, which was considerable and sometimes flattering and sometimes pointed and always intelligent. They argued, eventually. Real arguments, once the communication architecture was solid enough to support them. About what should happen next. About what Cale wanted versus what the institutions managing the situation needed. About the tension between Cale's autonomy as a person and her status as, technically, a ward of circumstances that no one had chosen. Dara argued on Cale's behalf more often than not. This created friction with her chain of command. She accepted the friction because she'd decided in month one that her primary responsibility was not to the institutional process but to the integrity of the contact itself, which required that Cale have at least one person in her corner who was genuinely in her corner. Her commander eventually promoted her for it. The promotion came with a long conversation about how the distinction between advocacy and insubordination was going to require constant calibration going forward. Dara agreed. She'd been calibrating it her whole career. In month 6, Cale communicated something that Dara has thought about every day since. The communication was complex enough that she won't claim to have the translation exactly right. But the substance of it was this, that before the mission's catastrophic end, her crew had been debating whether to make direct contact with Earth's inhabitants or to continue non-interacting observation. The debate, apparently, had not been resolved before the failure that ended the mission. Cale was expressing, with a precision that suggested she had been thinking about it for a long time, that she no longer thought the debate mattered. Because the contact had been made. Not by committees or protocols or deliberate institutional decisions. By a storm and a cave and two injured beings who decided to sit near each other's warmth. And the outcome of that accidental contact was the entire basis upon which everything happening now was built. Dara thought about the first moment in the cave. The 14 seconds of stillness. The choice she'd made to sit down rather than draw her weapon. What would have happened, she asked, when she was sure the communication structure was solid enough to support the question? If I'd done the other thing? Cale's response took a long time to arrive and longer to translate. The substance of it, as best Dara has been able to reconstruct, was, I would have defended myself. I would probably have survived. You would probably not have. And whatever came after would have been shaped by that rather than by this. Dara wrote it down. She writes most things down. 11 years of notebooks now, from the one she'd been carrying in the cave through the one she fills today, in a role that has no precedent and no manual, and that she is, in the most literal sense, writing as she goes. The world officially learned about Cale and the wreckage and the contact 2 years after the cave. The disclosure was managed, imperfectly because it's not possible to manage something like this perfectly, and the period that followed was complicated in ways that were predictable and ways that weren't. Dara was not the face of the disclosure. She was not built for that kind of visibility, and she'd argued against her own centrality in the public framing because she was genuinely not the point. The point was the contact itself. What it meant. What it demonstrated. That humanity's first encounter with an intelligence from another world had been, at its most essential, two hurt individuals in a dark place, deciding whether to be afraid of each other. And one of them deciding, no. The choice wasn't heroic. It wasn't strategic in the grand sense. It didn't reflect the best technology or the most sophisticated doctrine or the accumulated institutional wisdom of the species. It reflected, Dara will tell you if you ask her, and she says it without drama, without the weight of someone who has decided they did something historic, but with the plainness of someone describing something true, the decision that the situation was the threat and not the person. That treating the being across from you as a problem to be managed is almost never the right answer. That warmth, offered carefully, is usually the better move. Outside the window of the office where she does most of her work now, a converted research station in Alaska because the geography matters, because proximity to the mountain matters, the first light is coming up over the range. The same range. The same sky that had produced the storm that shouldn't have existed and had therefore made everything that followed possible. She drinks her coffee. She thinks about Cale, who is not here this morning but will be this afternoon because the schedule has them in the same meetings and the work is ongoing and probably will be for decades, and the work is hard and necessary and the most important thing she has ever done. She thinks about the cave. She opens her notebook. She writes, Day 847. Contact maintained. trust intact. Work continues. And beneath it, because she has learned enough by now to write it in Kale's language as well as her own, we are what we expected.